we present Beowulf, an original adaptation, written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge.
Part 7. Grendel. Beowulf lay in the dark of the abandoned Hierot, waiting. The spring night air smelled fresh and crisp with the promising scent of the nearby summer, but all around them was quiet. Just hours before, Queen Walthio had passed a cup of greeting around the hall, formally welcoming Beowulf and his Geatland warriors into the safety and protection of Daneland. And now here they were, waiting to fight a Jotun beast of myth and legend. His eyes now adjusted to the darkness, Beowulf scanned the hall to check the location of each of the warriors he had brought with him. Axel stood sentinel by the door, Weoxstan was up in the rafters with his bow, Gunnar was nearby to his right. Gradually his gaze came to rest on each of his men, waiting and worrying silently. The Danes had bid them welcome, wished them well, and roundly declined to join them. Oh, they had offered weapons and armour and prayers to all the gods they had ever heard of, but they would not attempt to fight the creature by their side. Perhaps Beowulf was wrong to judge them. He himself had never seen the monster Grendel, and perhaps once he had, he would have no heart to repeat the act. But that not one of them came. Well, he would soon see if their fear was warranted. There was a soft scraping sound to the left, and every man's head whipped in the same direction, only to spot a shamefaced Leif, whose coat of mail had clinked against the wall as he shifted. All the men wore such mail, a gift from the Danes in some attempt to excuse their absence from the hall. No doubt they would be able to reclaim the armour if the Geats' attempt did not succeed, but perhaps it was better not to think on that. Beowulf alone wore no armour. In fact, he wore no shirt at all and carried no weapon either. He had believed the claim of the Danes that weapons were of no use against this monster, and so he carried none. Why hold tight to a weapon if it's only dead weight in your hand? He would face this monster with the strength and skill that God had gifted him, and either he was equal to the task, or he would die, and that was his weird. The Geats liked to boast that Beowulf had the strength of 30 men, and right now Beowulf prayed that they were right. He prayed that 30 would be enough. Another scratching sound came, and all eyes shot towards Leif, but this time he shook his head and motioned outside. Another scratch came, followed by a snuffling sound and a grunt. Leif gestured towards the door, and they all turned to look as a vast shadow passed over it. Grendel was coming. Beowulf had instructed the Danes not to offer tribute that night. All it will find is disappointment and death, he had told them. But whose death would it be? Now the monster was actually here, he began to doubt his former confidence. From outside there was another scraping sound and heavy footsteps as the creature made its way around Hierot. The footsteps reached the front of the hall where the tribute was usually tethered, and they stopped. Silence. Beowulf had expected confusion or groaning and grunting, but instead there was just this silence. Not the silence of a dumb animal, this was the silence of an intelligent predator considering its prey. To a man, the Geats in the hall stood frozen, all of them straining their ears for any sound that might give them a clue to the creature's next move. But none came. Everything in Beowulf wanted to creep to the door and see if he could catch sight of the beast, but he schooled his body to stillness and waited. Silence. In the darkness he almost missed it, but there it was, looming into the room through an open window at the back of the hall, a great grey arm swiping through the air. The claws on the huge hand came within a hair's breadth of Leif, and the warrior threw himself to the ground, somehow managing to avoid crying out. How did it move so silently? Beowulf's mind screamed at him, as he signalled to Leif to stay down and keep silent. As quickly as it had come, the arm disappeared through the window, and silence reigned once more. Beowulf was wrong-footed. Clearly he had underestimated the creature. No slathering beast this, it was a cunning and clever killer. There was no sound from outside now, and in the darkness Beowulf could tell his men were nervous. Again, a vast arm snaked in through the window, this time on the other side of the hall, and slashed across the space. This time it was Ulf who barely managed to dodge aside, the claws on the giant's hands crashing into the wall where the man had been standing just heartbeats before. There was the tortured rasp of timber as talons scraped along the wall, and then the hand was gone once more. Silence. That horribly eerie terror of not knowing where the next attack would come from. It was Gunnar's gurgling cry that let the whole room know, and all eyes swiveled towards him to see the great creature's claw buried deep into his neck. A sick, wet, bubbling sound was gasping out of Gunnar, coupled with the unsteady drip and splatter of his blood on the ground. For an immortal moment the Geats were too stunned to speak as they watched Gunnar bleed, the life draining from him in spurting pulses. Then there was a slick thump as Gunnar's body hit the floor and the hand snaked away. This time there was no silence, though. Heavy booming footsteps thudded around the building as the monster made its way to the door, accompanied by grinding laughter. Clearly, Grendel was done with silence. It had served its purpose. Now it wanted the Geats to know it was coming, and they would suffer the same fate as Gunnar. In the hall, the warriors sank deeper into the shadows and clutched tightly to their weapons for all the good it would do them. Axel backed away from the door, and it was good he did, for at that moment the beast began hauling itself inside to rampage among them. As it clawed its way through the doorway, Beowulf wanted to cry out in panic, but inside he heard his father's voice echoing through the years, "Tame the fire." Yes, he could do that. What was panic but a different kind of fire? Taking a deep breath, he dropped to the ground, hidden by the shadow of a bench, and watched as the creature hunched through the doorway. It was tall, as they had known it would be, so it stood stooped even in the high hall of Hjerot. Those long mottled arms hung down past shaggy fur-covered legs. He'd half expected cloven hooves like the demons he'd heard tell of, but instead it had scaly, taloned feet like a great bird. Its chest was smooth and hairless, but spurs of bone spiked out all over the monster's torso, like broken tree limbs after a storm. Thick, dark fur ran over its shoulders and down its back, though ridges of bone stood proud along its spine. As it looked around the hall and the moonlight caught its face, Beowulf saw it fully. Its features were wreathed in shadow, for Grendel had 3 sets of horns. One set stood proud above its head like a bull, one set curled around like a ram and traced the line of its jaw, and the third set wrapped tightly round its face, running just below its eyes. And what eyes those were! Dull, coal-black, but with pinprick sparks of cold blue light at the very centre. They were eyes that knew no joy or happiness or delight in anything but death. As the monster stalked around the room, Beowulf offered a silent prayer that his strength would be enough. The creature searched the shadows and sniffed the air, cocking its head to hear clearly through those curling ram's horns. Beowulf's men were all standing silent. Some sign, though, gave away Axel's presence in his new position by the wall, and Grendel stalked towards him. His path led directly past Beowulf, and not allowing himself to think about it, he reached out with both hands and grabbed the creature around the arm. Beowulf was a big man. It had been a while since anyone could pick him up, but for a moment he was terrified that Grendel had not even felt him. In the next instant, though, he felt himself lifted higher as Beowulf was hoisted to the monster's eyeline for inspection. A wordless roar of defiant indignation rolled out of its mouth as he saw the warrior with the death grip on its arm, and Beowulf stole his moment. Lashing out with boot-clad feet, Beowulf's foot connected hard with the creature's face just between the sections guarded by horn. Again, Grendel cried out, and Beowulf refused to let go, tightening his grip. The monster started to try and shake him off, and Beowulf gritted his teeth as he was whipped back and forth by the gigantic creature. Again he lashed out with a boot, catching the monster in the abdomen, missing bone spines by sheer chance. Perhaps his kick had landed in an unusually sensitive spot, or perhaps it was the rarity of anyone fighting back that caught the creature by surprise, but Grendel let out a grunting breath. Reaching around with its other arm, the beast tried to rake its talons along Beowulf's body as he held tightly to its arm. At the last possible second, Beowulf swung his torso aside and parted his hands, narrowly avoiding the claw that sunk deep into the creature's own arm. This time it gave a cry of anguish and returned to trying to shake him off, but Beowulf would not yield. Tightening his grip, he braced for impact as his back was slammed into one of the great oak columns that held up the roof. The support strut was half a yard thick, and Beowulf was convinced he could feel a new bruise arise for every year the timber had grown. He did not have time to think, though, as Grendel raised up his arm to slam him again. A second jolting thud shook through him, and Beowulf felt a wet snap in his side as a rib gave way. For a moment, his grip slackened. Again, the great arm drew back to slam him into the pillar, and Beowulf sent out a desperate prayer that he would survive this moment. Swinging towards the pillar, a human pendulum in the darkness, his body slammed into the beam and one arm released Grendel at last. The creature let out a cry of victory, but there was another note to it too. Relief. In a crystallizing moment, Beowulf suddenly understood. He was strong, perhaps as strong as any man could be, but still this creature was twice his strength. But with that strength it had clearly grown used to easy victory, and this attack had unsettled it. Like a man handling a small hound it had not expected to fear, the shock is great when the hound bites, and the shock is greater still when the hound will not let go. Redoubling his hold on Grendel's arm with one hand and wrapping the other around the oak post, Beowulf resolved that he would not let go. The oak would break or the beast would break, but he would stand strong. With great satisfaction he heard the monster groan in shock and discomfort. "That's right," he growled at the creature. "I'm not done with you." Perhaps it was his imagination, or perhaps it was the tone of stubborn determination in his voice, but Beowulf could swear that those dark eyes had widened in alarm. He couldn't tell for sure, though, because at that moment his men ran forward, weapons raised. In the midst of the grappling match, the two of them, man and monster, had fully forgotten anyone else was there, but Axel's cries as he ran forward drew their focus back. Axel sped straight towards the beast, but as the Danes had promised, the steel could not bite into its flesh. The Geats thrust and stabbed at the monster, but nothing so much as a scratch resulted. With its free arm, Grendel struck out at the Geats, those talons whistling past them with stunning speed. Ulf took a slash across the ribs that looked bad, and Axel was struck by a vicious backhand, but with Beowulf holding it fast, the creature could not lunge towards the men and follow up for the kill. Again, the monster turned its efforts towards Beowulf, trying to catch him up with its other hand, but Beowulf had been waiting for this. Releasing the oak pillar all of a sudden, he stepped smoothly behind the creature's back, dragging its great arm with him and wrenching it hard. With the arm pinioned between him and the creature's own spine, Beowulf heaved with all his might and drove the creature forward. With a flash of satisfaction, he heard the monster give out a yelp as it overbalanced and toppled forward. Twisting the arm further, Beowulf jerked and hauled on it, careless of the beast's ridged spine driving into his chest. An odd sense of calm had descended on him now. In the midst of this moment of extreme violence, he knew exactly what he needed to do, and exactly how to do it. The only thing that could stop him now was death, either his or his opponent's own, and he wasn't sure it mattered which. "I wonder if this is what it was like for my father in his berserker rages," some strangely detached part of his mind wondered idly. A growling shriek brought him back to the moment, though, and he wondered if it was him making the sound, but to his shock he realized it was the monster. As Beowulf wrenched and hauled on the twisted arm, Grendel was letting out a series of short, panicked shrieks. Clearly it had realized what Beowulf already knew, that he would not let go. The great body started writhing and twisting beneath Beowulf, and the shrieks became wild and manic. its ridged spine bent and flexed as it tried desperately to free itself from the vice that was Beowulf's grip. It let out another wail and tried to twist, and beneath its screams Beowulf could hear another sound. A horrible, sinewy, popping and grating noise erupted from Grendel's huge, hair-covered shoulder as bone and joints gave way. Suddenly the monster twisted and jerked for a final time and abruptly lunged free, scrabbling to the door and hauling itself through, a keening, mewling cry slurring from its slathering mouth. Through the battle haze that had descended on him, Beowulf saw nothing but his quarry, his kill, that which was his by right, and he ran towards the doorway, howling oaths and curses into the night. Just as he was about to sprint out into the darkness in chase, Axel's face loomed up before him, Ulf and Weoxton close behind, all of them yelling at him. Beowulf snarled at them, eager to hunt down his kill, and made to push them aside when the words they cried finally penetrated the bloodlust and settled in his mind. He is done. Beowulf stared at the men, struggling to understand what they meant. All of them were staring back at him towards his chest. He looked down to see what they saw. Clutched tightly in his hands, covered in black, oily blood, was the torn and ragged arm of Grendel. The monster had been so afraid that in its desperation it had wrenched off its own arm to escape. Beowulf looked down and saw a long trail of that black blood spewed across the earth beneath them, a viscous slick of spilled vitality, and he knew the truth of their words. Grendel, the man-killer, Cain's spawn and Jotun, was done.
Thanks for listening. Beowulf was a Settle Stories commission written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Warrior by Hartzman. Outro music was Travel in the Ocean by Monument Music. It was a Parable Arts production.